Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Uli, and this is episode 125 of the Forge of Freedom. Today, I have a special guest on the podcast, Michael Rectenwald, a fascinating figure who has worn many hats, author, professor, free speech advocate, and now presidential candidate. Michael is the author of over a dozen books that have tackled everything from 19th century British secularism to critiques of woke ideology and authoritarianism on college campuses. For years, he taught literature, writing, and courses on science and technology at New York University. However, Michael's life took a turn in 2016 when he began speaking out against what he viewed as the imposition of a social justice creed and suppression of free speech at NYU. This led to a forced leave of absence and his ultimate departure from the university in 2019. Since then, Michael has become a prominent voice railing against cancel culture, authoritarianism from both the left and the right, and the erosion of civil liberties. His latest book, The Great Reset and the Struggle for Liberty and Beyond Woke, have made him a celebrated figure among free speech advocates. And now in 2024, Michael has taken his passion for liberty to a new level by announcing his candidacy for the U.S. presidency on the Libertarian Party ticket. He is running on a platform of maximizing individual freedom while opposing all forms of totalitarianism. Michael joins us today to discuss his unusual journey, his battles for free expression on campus, his work, and his presidential campaign, and his vision for protecting liberty in America. Welcome to the show, Michael.
It's great to be here, Alex. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, like I said, we want to talk primarily about your journey from sort of leftism to libertarianism. And I actually discovered you initially because of the Tom Woods show. I've been a listener to that podcast for since the beginning, since episode 1. So I don't know when that was exactly, but I think you were maybe first on the podcast back in 2020. I don't remember the exact
It goes
date.
back further than that. I think it was 2018.
2018. Okay. Well,
yeah.
The first one I heard, I think, was in 2020. And I've been sort of loosely following your work since then, and then even more so since you announced your candidacy for president. But I discovered this chapter actually from a book called Libertarian Autobiographies by Joanne Cavallo and Walter Block. And the chapter is just called From Leftism to Liberty, A Personal Journey. And I thought that it was worthwhile to talk about for our listeners of this podcast and for many other folks who I think find themselves in the same camp. I was once a sort of a neocon, a conservative, but I think there are lots of folks who are sort of on the other end of the political spectrum who just are not satisfied with the current form of governance and the way that that politics currently conducts itself. So I think there are lots of people out there who are dissatisfied and are yearning for the sort of message that you're spreading. And I think you're a great person to do that, obviously with your teaching background. So if you would start out just by tell us a little bit about what was, this was in 2016, that the events that brought all this about. Give us a little background and tell us what happened that started your sort of transformation.
Sure. So, even starting a little earlier than that, I started to have real questions and doubts about the kind of things that the woke left, as you might call them now, that term didn't really exist yet. We're trying to foist on people in my political group. A lot of the transgender stuff, and furthermore, at NYU in particular, a lot of hiring practices that were extremely questionable in terms of the way they were selecting professors. And I was on a committee to hire a professor of writing and journalism, and it turned into a fiasco, at least for me, and I think the university, because I was looking at these candidates strictly in terms of their qualifications and abilities and not their identities. And I ran into a real stone wall on that. And because I couldn't endorse a particular candidate for the job of writing professor and journalism professor, I got bounced off the committee entirely. And then there was a seminar held at the end of the semester in 2016 in the spring about the social justice policies that were coming down the pike, including the safe spaces and trigger warnings. And then there had been, in the fall of 2016, a lot of speeches, talks by conservative or right-wing speakers canceled, and a lot of no platforming of speakers going on. And then they instituted in the fall of 2016 a bias reporting hotline where students could report their professors for bias infractions and microaggressions. And I thought all of this combined was leading to an extremely problematic, prohibitive and chilling effect in the university. It was, you have a surveillance system, you have safe spaces, you have trigger warnings, you have no platforming of speakers. And so I started this Twitter account to talk about this stuff. It was anti-PC NYU prof, since canceled by X and never restored. And before you know it, I was asked by a student newspaper reporter at NYU if I was really an NYU professor, because I was going under this Twitter handle with the name The Deplorable NYU Prof. And I chose that name not out of a Donald Trump. I wasn't a fan of Donald Trump at all. In fact, I didn't even follow his campaign. What it was when Hillary Clinton called all of his followers a basket of deplorables, which I found to be deplorable in itself. And, so I agreed to this student newspaper reporter's query and decided to go on record as myself, voicing the criticisms that I had with what was going on, not only at NYU, but across the country. Because I was following a lot of developments, all of them very censorious and ideologically straitjacketing developments. And so after that interview appeared in the newspaper, student newspaper, within 2 days, I was called into the dean's office and pushed out into a leave of absence. And then simultaneously, I was condemned by the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Group, who declared that I was guilty for the structure and content of my thinking. And that was it. I was like, these people are absolute tyrants. And I started to wake up to the totalitarian nature of the left. I renounced the left in one fell swoop, all of it, and said I wanted nothing further to do with it. I think that tweet on Twitter had some 50,000 likes. It was enormous reach that tweet got. And then, I immediately embraced what we would call civil libertarianism, vouching for the utmost importance, primacy, really, of individual liberty and freedom of speech. And then, we were talking before the show, I started digging into the political and economic libertarian thought. And before you know it, by Christmas time of 2016, I was a full-fledged libertarian. This is from having been a Marxist before that.
Yeah. So what was it? I mean, I could see you having some fallout with the administration, maybe your colleagues at NYU, but not really rethinking your own worldview. What was it that really, I guess, provided the motivation for you to look for other ideas and new ideas?
Well, there were a lot of things that I had suppressed or repressed in dealing with, in being a leftist and a communist, issues that I kind of just squelched in my own thinking and thought, well, that's, I guess there's an answer for this, but I don't, I didn't really work it out. Like, why did so many people get slaughtered in the Soviet Union and China and so on and so forth? Why were there a prison system of gulags, and why did they take away freedom of speech as soon as the Bolsheviks took over? Things like this. That was another thing I did immediately. I started to delve into studying the political criminality of leftism when it's in power. And that was another major venue of exploration and eye-opening awareness of just how leftism is really a totalitarian ideology, no matter what they say. And what really caused it was, I guess, that what had been pent up questions, doubts, and misgivings that just rose to the surface now and became fully conscious for me.
So in this chapter, you say, at the time, I thought I was merely voicing criticisms of the excesses and insanity of a left that had become utterly alien to me, seemingly overnight. Little did I know I was on the brink of a complete philosophical, political, and spiritual transformation. Now, pre-show, I mentioned it was a coincidence, I think, but it's interesting that your first introduction to Mises was his book Socialism, which was my first introduction to socialism. A good friend of mine gave me that book, and it just sort of transformed my thinking about the world. What was it about that book that sort of transformed your thinking? Was there any particular point that he made in that book that was compelling to you?
There was several. So I'll just list them. One of them was the way that Marx had never dealt with the question of how would a socialist society run. And in fact, any kind of criticisms of his economics, he just dismissed all the detractors as bourgeois. And his analysis of, this is Mises now, see, one of the big selling points for me of Marxism was that the idea that it led to economic democracy, so-called. But I read Mises, and he made it very clear through his discussion of what's known as the calculation problem, and also just the sense of the fact that it's under capitalism, it's the consumer that really determines what the means of production are and what they'll do, because they voice their wishes with their dollars, with purchasing power. And then, so with the calculation problem too, which is that the idea that, if you can't calculate the cost of, if there's no prices in the market for factors of production, then in fact, there's no way to determine what to make or how much of it to make or with what materials or anything. And so I had always been trained to think of capitalism as the anarchy of the marketplace. It turns out that it is socialism that is the anarchy of the marketplace. There's no clues as to what to do, so it has to be imposed from above. And prices have to be fixed and determined by whatever means necessary, like all kinds of ridiculous means, like the labor theory of value, how much labor is embedded in something. It's absurd, because that's not what value is determined by. So all of this started unraveling, and I got out of the kind of fix that I was in intellectually. It took away all the knots and untied them all. And I saw that socialism was nothing like what I had suggested it was for years. It's actually a very, not only impossible system, it can't be established and run for any consistent period or length of time. Furthermore, it's totally anti-democratic. It has to be top down. It has to be totalitarian. And then I recognized that, how do you keep, that it's a monopoly system run by the state in most cases, where the state monopolizes all production. How do you keep a monopoly in place? You have to use political force, and you have to squelch opposition and crush it. And this is not only economic opposition, but ideological opposition. You can't permit it, because to maintain this monopoly, you have to get rid of all competitors, both in the realm of ideas and in the realm of the market of economics.
I had a podcast discussion with Rob Weir, who is a contributor at Mises, the Mises Institute website.
Yeah.
And he wrote a book about the Seligman-Nearing debate, which took place prior to the Great Depression. But one of the points in that debate, and one of the points that many Marxists make, is that there's that individuals are entitled to their job, but also that they're entitled to the full value of their labor.
Right.
And I think that at the point that you're making about consumers being the ones in charge,
yes,
is a powerful one. And that was a huge enlightening moment for me.
Was it?
Because it's not the businessman, it's not the corporation that has control, right? Because if they don't have any customers, then they don't exist. They cease to exist. And that's part of the power, I think, of free market capitalism, is that it really does return the authority, the power to the people, to the individual.
Yes.
And I think that was...
And I was always trained by Marxist thought that, the thing that is wrong with capitalism is that this one capitalist class controls the means of production. Now, that's the, byline. But as it turns out, they don't. It's actually consumers that control the means of production. So that was a massive gestalt shift right there.
And they do that through price signals, through profits and losses, which are demonized by most of the mainstream politicians and the media, right? That we have to bail out these huge corporations when they're too big to fail.
Mm-hmm.
But we have to maintain prices at levels that are affordable, that people can. And so there's this sort of imposition of control over the market, and it takes away the effectiveness of those profit and loss signals. And essentially takes away the power of the consumer.
Right. And even, progressives and liberals have to demonize the capitalist, because this really makes way for their role as they see it in the economy, which is to be this mediator between the consumer, producer, working class, or whatever, and the capitalist class. Without the belief that there's some fatal flaw in capitalism, there's no role for the state in the economic realm at all. And so they play on this premise without even acknowledging what it is. This premise that the worker is exploited at the point of production because the capitalist siphons off surplus value at the point of production, which is robbing the workers of their rightful pay, because they should get the whole value of these goods, as opposed to some percentage based on this exploitation that's supposed to exist. But there is no such thing as this exploitation at the point of production routinely, because value isn't determined by labor hours embedded in a commodity, as the Marxists say of the capitalist order. Value is subjective, and value is what people will pay for something and whether they want it in the first place. So there is no way to get value outside of the marketplace. There's no way to determine value outside of the marketplace. So this puts it right back in the market. The determination of value is determined in the market. It's not determined in advance of some market, like at the point of production. This is just nonsense, Otherwise, I could go outside and dig a hole for 8 hours and then fill it back up for another 6 and say that it's worth X amount of money, when it's not. It's not worth anything unless somebody wants me to dig a hole and pay for it.
Yeah. One thing you say this, and I like the way you put this, that all socialism is utopian, and that utopianism is just totalitarianism in waiting. And I think that and you've talked about that already, that there, with no price system, without the consumers in control, and providing that feedback through pricing, through placing their subjective value on goods and resources, there's somebody who has to set the prices, and that ultimately is in the form of a totalitarian sort of dictator.
Yes, they have to be a dictator, at least, or a bureaucratic class under the dictator that determines all this based on what the state wants. And so then the state is effectively controlling what you get to consume. And it also controls what you do. So you become, one of the things is that under communism, the first thing that's forfeited is the property in oneself. This is what the free market acknowledges, that people have property in themselves first and foremost. And then what they do with that property is up to them. And then whatever they create becomes their property too. Whatever they create from things they already own. Okay, so I say that because the Marxists will say, well, that's right, the labor theory of value, the worker should get the goods, but they don't create it from what they already own.
Yeah. They don't create the job.
Right.
Yeah.
Those are resources provided by the capitalists, as it were.
Right.
And then, of course, as I said again, not only does it become dictatorship economically, but they have to be a dictatorship politically and ideologically. Every time this occurs, they must get rid of all political and ideological competition. And this is why they put people in gulags. This is why they ban competing political parties. It has to be that way because it has to be totalitarian by virtue of the fact that it is a monopoly scheme.
I like this point that you make too about the self-ownership as the first thing that you lose, your property in oneself. And I actually think I have some disagreement with among, of course, there's always disagreement among libertarian circles, right?
Goes without saying.
Yeah, exactly. But oftentimes the non-aggression principle is put forth as the founding principle of libertarianism, right? The initial principle. But I think that the point you make is the true root of libertarianism, right? That self-ownership is where it all starts. Would you mind to say a little bit about that?
The reason why it comes before the non-aggression principle is because self-ownership is what people aggress against, okay, when they violate the NAP. So unless there's something inviolable that's being violated, then what does the NAP mean? It means nothing. What it means is my self-ownership means that I have property in myself. And likewise, you can't take that property. You can't do it by virtue of violence against me, or by virtue of killing me, or by virtue of stealing what I make. So that's why I say self-ownership is number one. Second is the property and what one makes out of what one owns. And third is the non-aggression principle.
Right. Yeah, I prefer that framework as well. I think that's because I think a lot of people get confused if they start with the non-aggression principle and don't start with self-ownership.
Yeah, on what basis is it a violation? What basis? What would constitute a violation otherwise? You have to have something that's violated. So you have to have a prior principle before the non-aggression principle.
Right.
But some people don't think logically.
Exactly. Another point that you make in this chapter, you say that Mises showed that the inevitability that Marxism claims for socialism is metaphysical and religious in character. And I read that when I read Socialism back in 2012, but it didn't really sink in with me until I visited China. And I went to a rural community in China, and there was a bed and breakfast. And at the bed and breakfast in the main room in the building, there was a huge portrait of Mao. And it would be like, it was like the worship hall almost.
Right.
And so that just really sort of burned into my mind how strange that was, and how this political figure was seen as a religious figure.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what are your thoughts on that? I think
Yes.
that was
So
the example for me. But
yeah, that's a good example. They have to create religious figures, icons, religious iconography comes. You have to have saints of the religion. But primarily, the thing is that what they do is they replace Christianity with a new savior, which is technically supposed to be the working class. But then they have saints to this savior, like Mao and Stalin and Che and what's his name, Castro, and all those horrible creeps and killers. Okay, and Lenin. And it's interesting you mentioned this about Mao having, they still have icons to Mao, pictures of Mao everywhere. Imagine that. Here's a guy that killed 60 million people, of his own people, and yet they honor him. I mean, this should be as shameful as putting up a picture of Hitler. It really should be, but it's not, because the left dominates discourse generally.
Yeah. It was really eerie to me. That was the I think the best way to describe the feeling that I felt when I saw that portrait. All right, so we're getting close to 30 minutes here. I'm going to try to keep it as close to 30 minutes as we can, and I'll link, of course, to this chapter from the book. And the chapter is called "From Leftism to Liberty: A Personal Journey." For those who want to go check it out, I certainly encourage people to go check that out. But I'd like you to say, before we close up, just a little bit about, we've talked about your conversion sort of to libertarianism, to this more freedom mindset. What drove you to run for president? And would you mind to say a little bit about your platform there for?
Sure. Well, what drove me? First of all, I never had political ambition. Okay, and never particularly wanted to be an employee of the state because I come to hate the state. Murray Rothbard makes that one of his prime criteria for a libertarian. Do you hate the state or not? And ironically, in a debate between the other libertarian candidates, inclusive of myself, I was the only one who said, yes, I hate the state, because the state is a vulture. It's a vampire. It's a parasite. So the reason I'm running is I was asked by the Mises caucus. But secondly, I want the party and the American public to know what the platform of maximum liberty might look like. And that is a completely private property, fully private property, anarcho-capitalist society, where the state is not in the middle. Now, that doesn't mean nations would go away. Like, you'd have countries, right? Like the territory of the United States. It just wouldn't be controlled by the central government, right? You'd have local governance, really ultimately self-governance, with private property protection and private firms for adjudication of disputes and for criminal behavior and so forth. And so I say that, why do we allow this one monopoly? We libertarians are supposed to be free market thinkers altogether. We're supposed to believe in the free market, yet we reserve this monopoly for one particular entity, the state. And I want to get the message out that is not full maximum liberty. Maximum liberty is getting rid of the state. The state is the interference. The more I read of economics, like J.B. Say and Rothbard's History of Economics, his Austrian review of economic history, the more I realize that this entity called the government or the state is like a total drain on people. It produces nothing, and yet it is the only entity that can take your money without an agreement or a contract, and does it so at the end of a gun, with force or the threat of force. And those are violations of the NAP, period. So how can any libertarian believe in the state? It's just not really consistent. So I wanted a consistent message. And also the other idea, and this will feather into my campaign platform, is that I wanted to get across that what I think is the best strategy for attaining liberty. It's not the end, it is the means. And that is the means of decentralization. controlling ourselves having local governance that that gives us control over our own life circumstances locally. This means, nullifying and shedding and resisting the impositions of the central government. This gets us closer to liberty. The more local governance is, the more liberty we have. And finally, I wanted to put my money where my mouth was. I had written a lot of books. I had given a lot of speeches. I had done a lot of this for money. I mean, we all have to work for a living, and I was making money at this, good money. Since I left NYU, I was making like 2 and 3 times what I did as a full professor, and that's good. The market is a good thing, but I wanted to put my money where my mouth was, and actually get in the game more directly to get this message out to the American public and hopefully the world at large.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Michael Rectenwald, I really appreciate you coming on the show today. I think that the message that you're promoting is an important one. And like I said at the beginning of the show, I think that more and more people are unsatisfied with the current state of affairs and are more receptive than ever to the sort of message that you're spreading. And I think that if people just hear what you have to say, you may just plant the seed, and it may take a little while, but ultimately that seed will result in a harvest of more liberty.
Amen.
So thank you so much for what you're doing. I know that the convention is coming up later in the month, and you had an appearance with Ron Paul last week as well. Would you mind just briefly to mention that appearance on the Ron Paul Liberty Report?
Yeah, I sure. I was on with Ron Paul. I got to say, one of the greatest honors of my life, and quite frankly, one of the most moving encounters I've had in some time. First of all, this guy is a champion, an absolute champ. He's in his late 80s, and he's still out there fighting away for us. And that is just immeasurably gratifying to have a chance to talk with him. And secondly, that he's such a kind man. I mean, he's a gentle, kind person who is uplifting and that is positive. And so we touched on the topic of political nihilism at the end, and he just said there's no case to be made for it. And if somebody that age who's been through that much can still say that, then damn well we can continue to say that, and we can continue to fight. Yeah. So I felt like he passed me the baton, and I feel like I have to take charge of it now.
Yeah, he's a hero to me as well. I was actually on an official visit to West Point when I heard the debate between he and Rudy Giuliani, and he brought up the concept of blowback.
Yeah.
And he was ultimately the main reason why I decided not to go to West Point.
Wow.
So that was a pretty amazing and memorable experience for me. So I was happy to see that you're on his show and had that platform to talk to people worldwide, really.
Yeah.
So that's amazing.
Thank you.
The other thing, just before we close, there was and I'm not going to play this, I'll just insert it in post-production, but you had a video montage that you put together that's a couple minutes long. I'll plug that into the show here once we're off, done recording, so that people can listen to that. Where else can people find out about you? I know I'll link to your campaign website, Rectenwald2024.com. Is there anywhere else people should be looking for information about you?
Yeah, probably where you found that essay, which was michaelrectenwald.com. That's where you get like the whole background of my, I talk, all of my essays, all of my interviews, everything is kept there. All my press that I've gotten over the last 7 years, it's all there, compiled in one place. And all the essays are free. The only thing I charge for are books. I used to sell merchandise too, but I don't have time for it right now. But yeah, michaelrectenwald.com. And another way to remember my campaign website is rectheregime.com, rectheregime.com. It goes to the same place.
Yeah. And I love that tagline too, by the way. That's a great way, I think, to remember what you're all about is getting rid of the state, getting rid of the regime, right?
Absolutely.
So perfect.
Yeah.
All right, Dr. Rectenwald, well, thank you so much for joining the show today. I really appreciate you taking the time to come on.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks everybody for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe to help us spread the message of freedom. As always, you can find the show on YouTube, Rumble, Facebook, and all the most popular podcast streaming platforms. You can also find us on X at Forge of Freedom and at forgeoffreedom.com. Until next time, everybody, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.
I'm Michael Rectenwald, and I'm running for president as a libertarian. Several years ago, I was in a status cult. When I came out of that cult, it was like I had come out of Plato's cave, very dazzled. The light had been beaming in my eyes. I now saw that I had been looking at replicas of reality, and I now was able to see clearly. I felt the liberation viscerally, and this is the kind of experience that we need to give to other people. We need to be able to break them out of their various statist propagandized cults. And this is something that makes the task of the candidate broader than an electoral battle. This is a cultural battle. And I don't mean the standard fare culture wars. I'm talking about a culture war against statism. That's what we need. I'm the candidate who best understands all of the threats to our liberty, all of the impending crises that the regime will bring down on us. For example, the war imperialism, the proxy wars, the Fed, the alphabet agencies, the regulatory regime, the security state, the military-industrial complex, but also the censorship industrial complex, the threat of global governance, the threat of this climate catastrophism. We need to look at this as a broader role than has been framed. What we need is somebody who is versed at countering the narratives that are being used against us. Under COVID, we had all kinds of propaganda and narrative power being foisted on us. It wasn't enough to argue abstract libertarian principles. You needed to know what this propaganda was about and how to see through it. If we wanted a mere vote getter, I think we'd nominate RFK Jr. Wouldn't that be just the most antithetical thing that we could possibly do? That means we're not just out here to get votes. We're out here to spread the message of liberty.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Forge of Freedom. Be sure to subscribe wherever you heard this podcast so you never miss a future episode. For more information or to connect with Alex, you can go to forgeoffreedom.com or follow him on Twitter at Forge of Freedom. Until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.